at the appropriate time, but please stay muted while you're not having the floor. So welcome, everybody. We have so many wonderful researchers and people passionately interested in history and family history. But for this series, we've got the real McCoy. You know, these are the people who are professionally researching and doing the work. And we're really privileged to hear from them, to have this little series of 3 talks curated by professors, Professor Shirley Gilbert, who's a professor at UCL in London, and Professor Adam Mendelsohn, who's professor of history at UCT and director of the Kaplan Center. So I'm really happy to hand over to Adam, who's going to unmute and who's going to introduce our first speaker, Reviva Hasson.
Thanks, Geraldine, and lovely to see everyone. So it's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Reviva Hasson. Reviva is a research officer at the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town. And the Kaplan Center, its mission is to conduct research about Jews in Southern Africa and to develop resources which enable research around topics connected with the history and of Jews within Southern Africa. And Reviva has now been working at the Kaplan Center for the last number of years as our first full-time and permanent social scientist. This came out of an understanding that we actually know much more in a way about the history of the South African and Southern African Jewish community than we do about the contemporary community. So yes, the Kaplan Center conducts roughly every decade a major survey of the community. And yes, there are research projects and there is some research done on the contemporary community, so Jews in Southern Africa today, but little of it is done systematically. And so Reviva's appointment was with this in mind, that someone should be responsible for collecting data, for conducting research of a demographic nature, of an attitudinal nature, collecting data systematically about Jewish life in Southern Africa today. And this is what Reviva has done for the last number of years. Reviva's background is originally as someone trained in economics, but we're very much with a social scientific focus. And she first became involved with the Kaplan Center actually before 2019. She coordinated the last major national survey that we conducted, the 2019 study of the South African Jewish community. And she'll be talking this evening about one of the projects that she has really worked on since. And this is, again, it demonstrates the beauty of having someone whose focus is on both collecting and then analyzing data relating to trends within the South African Jewish community. And her talk to this evening really will showcase the project that she's been working on relating to migration of Jews from South Africa. And this is the work that she'll present is going to be forthcoming soon in a leading journal within the field. So again, it gives you a demonstration of the value of this work, both in terms of understanding trends within the South African Jewish community, but also this is work of major academic significance as well, to really understand what's going on in terms of migration patterns amongst South African Jews. So it's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce Reviva.
Thank you, Adam. It's lovely to be hosted on this platform this evening. I'm going to just first check that I can share my screen and that everything is working there. And hopefully you should be able to see the screen as well as me at the same time. There's a way you can split the screen. Geraldine, you're going to give me the thumbs up that it's working? Okay, excellent. So before I begin, I'm interested to know who am I speaking to? Like, how many people here have immigrated? Just by just raising your hands on the screen if you have immigrated. Okay, that's quite a lot. And how many people used to live in South Africa? Or live in South Africa currently? Okay, so I'm very much speaking to a group of experts here. It's a bit intimidating, and I'm sure everyone has their own personal story about how they and their family, or even if they haven't immigrated themselves, certainly majority of South Africans have close family who have immigrated. And maybe after the talk, I'd be happy to hear people's stories and what resonated from the talk, and how that resonated with people's personal journeys of migration. So without further ado, let's jump in. So this is a graph that shows what we know about the South African Jewish population. It starts in the 1880s and goes all the way up to the most recent point that we have data, which was in 2019 when we ran the National Community Survey. And it shows how the South African Jewish community has grown, first from immigrants arriving on the South African shores from Britain and Germany, and then from the 1880s, where there was quite a lot of immigration that took place, not from Western Europe, but more from Eastern Europe. And then that immigration trend stopped with the 1930s Quota Act and 1937 Aliens Act, which effectively stopped further immigration. So from the 1940s onward, which is this section, where's 1940? Around this area, this is natural growth. There was very little immigration coming in, and the growth in the population was from the indigenous population. But as you can see, this population trend started to flatten out, and it reached a peak in the 1970s, where the population was approaching 120,000 Jews in South Africa. But that was the maximum that we got to in South Africa. And the inflection point is probably in the 60s, but certainly after the 1976 Soweto riots, which were anti-apartheid riots, and seeing how the national government responded to them, immigration really started taking hold of the community. And the population subsequently declined. And this population decline didn't stop when the 1994 democratic elections took place. It's continued since then, such that today, in the most recent data that we have from 2019, the population has more than halved, so that the estimate is around 52,000 Jews that are living in South Africa. Before I jump into really the deep dive of the data that we have, it's really important to contextualize where we are talking about. So South Africa, as I'm sure all of you know, is a middle-income industrializing country. And we have a population of 60 million people, and our growth rate, the GDP growth rate per year, is averaging at around 1% for the last 10 years, which is not a good sign. A country that is developing needs to have a much higher growth rate if it's to address the developmental challenges that come with a country in this position. One of the biggest challenges that South Africa has is unemployment. This map over here is a comparison of unemployment rates around the world. And the darker the red, the more significant, the higher the unemployment rate. And as you can see, South Africa is this dark red dot, which has an estimated unemployment of around 35%, one of the highest in the world. On the right is a map of the world showing the Human Development Index, which is a summary measure taking into account multiple measures of well-being, from longevity, health, education, standard of living, and so forth. And what this shows is it's on a range from white to dark blue, and the darker the color, the darker the blue is the higher the developmental index. So you've got countries like the USA, Canada, UK, most of Europe, and Australia sitting in the highest developmental index. And South Africa is very much middle of the road. It's not amongst the poorest countries, but it's also not amongst the highest income countries. And a developing country has many social challenges. We spoke about unemployment, but with unemployment comes poverty, comes crime, comes corruption, and a whole lot of social ills. And this is the context that the South African Jewish population lives in. However, what comes through clearly from multiple sources, both anecdotal research as well as statistics, can be summed up by what Tats Arnold and Heller wrote in their 2007 study on migration, is that South Africa offers a life better than most. From the constitution level, that South Africa is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, offering freedom of religion. And there are multiple studies that show that Jews are represented at the highest levels of business, academia, and the professions. Democracy, it's a new democracy, but it is alive and well. There have been 6 election cycles since 1994, and they've all occurred peacefully. There's a pleasant climate. I've never lived in Canada or the UK, but friends of mine that do live there tell me that that statement about how pleasant the South African climate is very true. And probably most importantly, when comparing countries, the cost of living in South Africa is comparatively lower than the destination countries that South African Jews typically move to. And this is shown in this map on the right-hand side, where the countries with a green mark have a much lower or are less, the cost of living is lower than average compared to the countries with a yellow or orange, which have a much higher cost of living. And that takes into account the cost of food items, property, services, and so forth. And I do have the source written there if anybody wants to go take a look. It's quite an interesting site. So South Africa has many reasons for offering a life better than most. And this comes out in the data that we see when we run our community survey. So from just looking at socioeconomic well-being measures, South African Jews, not talking about the general South African population, but within the Jewish community, 35% of South African Jews have a postgraduate degree or higher, and 59% hold at least a bachelor's degree. Now, this is a very high level of educational attainment. By comparison, the USA shows that only 28% of the Jewish population holds a postgraduate degree or higher. I spoke earlier about the fact that there is rampant unemployment within the general population, but within the Jewish community, the unemployment is measured to be much lower at 2.7%, on a par or even better than Jewish communities in USA and Israel. In the community survey, there was a question asking, how do people feel a sense of belonging in their country? And South African Jews, by and large, 74% stated that they have a strong sense of belonging. And you compare this to a similar question, which was asked in the Australian survey, it's quite interesting to see that South African Jews feel very much part of the country. Other factors of interest which speak to the standard of living, 84% of households employ domestic staff, and the majority of South African Jews own their home. These well-being indicators become even more sharper when looking at Jewish well-being indicators. The survey asked participants to rank their Jewish identity, and 3/4 ranked their Jewish identity as being 8 out of 10 or higher. That is a remarkably high level of Jewish identity consciousness. Jewish school attendance is high, 75%. That's higher than in all other Anglo diaspora communities. 89% of Jews in South Africa have visited Israel at least once. Australia is higher. Australia, 92% have visited. But compared to the USA, where only 33% have visited Israel at least once, it's a very high ranking. Amazingly, 100% of respondents said that they have given made a financial contribution to a Jewish charity in the past year. The intermarriage rate is the lowest in the Anglo-Jewish world at 19%. Compare this to in the UK, which is at 26%, or the USA at 58%. And then looking at more like the religious involvement, close to 50% say that they attend synagogue at least once a month, 91% fast on Yom Kippur, 33% have a kosher home. And even though this data on anti-Semitism predates the October 7th attacks and the change in the world that's happened since then, when we asked people if they have personally experienced verbal insults or harassment because of being Jewish, 9% said that they had, which is one of the lowest in the diaspora world, much low, on a par with Australia and significantly lower than the USA and Europe. These and many more stats were compared in a study put out by Adina Bankir-Karp last year. And her conclusion was that South Africa is one of the strongest Jewish communities in the world. In fact, she said South Africa has the highest measures of social, cultural, and religious levels of Jewish engagement. Canada, Australia, and the UK were held a middle-level position, and the USA had the lowest measures. So we have this paradox of South African Jewish immigration. South African Jews are not typical economic migrants. Typical economic migrants move because they see a potential for an improvement in material well-being. However, prospective South African immigrants generally know that when they arrive in their new country, they will be considerably poorer. It's the typical move of going from a large house with a pool and staff to a small apartment in Ranana or Sydney or London. So even though we see that South African is a developing country with many, many economic and development challenges, the economic measures of well-being amongst the Jewish population are generally good, and Jewish life is vibrant, well-organized, and there are studies that have shown that it's actually getting stronger, that especially in Johannesburg, there's been a Jewish revival of sorts. Furthermore, there's no threat of persecution, expulsion, or limitations on religious expression. This is not North Africa, Iraq, Syria in the 1950s. This is not Russia in the 1970s and 80s. Jewish life is alive and well, and all of this speaks to the paradox that immigration has persisted. And when we've tried to estimate the number of South African-born Jews that are living abroad, we see that there are more South African-born Jews living outside of South Africa than in South Africa, which is a remarkable statistic. We estimate that there are about 60,000 Jews, South African Jews, across USA, Australia, Israel, Canada, and the United Kingdom. So certainly there are other places where South Africans have gone, most prominently New Zealand, but it would increase the number by a few hundred. And so you've got about 60,000 South African-born Jews living around the world compared to close to 52,000 living in South Africa. We really do have a diaspora community. And similarly, our survey found that 3 in 5 South Africans have close family members living abroad. So this is a major trend and part of the South African Jewish dynamic. It's good to understand where the South African Jewish community fits in on the global scale. So if we look at the world Jewish population over here, you have the two giants of communities, Israel with close to 7 million Jews, and the United States with around 6 million Jews. And the other 14% are made up by significant countries would be France, Canada, and the United Kingdom, after which you've got Argentina, Russia, Germany, Australia. and Brazil, and then you have South Africa. A pretty, like, it looks middle of the road, but it's really a tiny, tiny fraction when one looks at it in the pie chart of world Jewry. South African Jews make up 0.3% of world Jewry, a real tiny, tiny fraction. We're the 11th largest Jewish community, and within the South African context, we don't even make up 0.1% of the South African population. To put this into context to put the story of South African Jewish immigration into context, a study recently came out by the Pew Research Center that showed that 20% of Jews reside outside of their country of birth. That's 3 million people. And it's much higher than any other religion. The world average is 3.6%. 3.6% of the world's population live outside of their country of birth, and for Jews it is significantly higher. And 51% of Jewish migrants worldwide are today in Israel. When we talk about Jewish immigration from South Africa, it forms part of the story of really South African immigration. And this graph shows that close to 1 million South Africans are known. They come up in surveys, are known to be living abroad. The majority, and this is general South Africans, we're going to go and talk about where Jewish South Africans are living just now, but the majority are living in the UK and Australia, followed by the United States, the United Arab Emirates, New Zealand, Canada, Netherlands, and Germany. And a small proportion are living in Israel. Israel is actually the 10th most popular destination for South African immigrants, and we can assume that majority of those are Jewish immigrants. So here, it's a lot of graphs, I know. This is actual immigration data. So this is people who are checking in at the borders of Israel, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And on entry, they say where they're from and they give their religion. And so we have quite good data. And this show has immigration trends going from 2001 all the way up to 2022. The most interesting thing to be taken from this graph is the change in the colors. So the orange wedge are immigrants, South African Jewish immigrants to Australia, whereas the blue wedge are South African Jewish immigrants going to Israel. And the purple wedge is immigrants going to the United Kingdom. And while the United Kingdom has remained pretty constant over the years, there's been a complete shift between Australia and Israel. In 2001, for every one person going to Israel, about 4 went to Australia. On the other hand, 20 years later, for every one person going to Australia, 3 went to Israel. This is one of the main findings of this research is the change in destination country of Jewish South Africans. And we're going to come back and speak to this some more as the presentation goes on. So we have 3 excellent data sets from which we can start to understand the what, where, and why of South African Jewish immigration. And in the post-apartheid era. Some surveys were done in like the 70s, and I think we had another survey. But the focus of this report is looking at community surveys post-1994. So the first survey we've got is from 1998, then which had about 1,000 respondents, 2005 also 1,000 respondents, and then the most recent 2019, where we went online with running the survey, and we had an incredible response rate with over 4,000 respondents. Now, before I start going into the answers, the what, where, and why, it will make it a lot more interesting for you if at this point you take a pencil and you write down what you think the results will show. So my first question to you is, our survey asked respondents, how likely are you to immigrate from South Africa in the next 5 years? And I want you to write down what you think the answer will be. So it's a percentage between 0 and 100. What percentage of people said that they are likely to immigrate from South Africa in the next 5 years? I then want you to think how this is likely to change by subgroup. So once we have established what percentage are likely to immigrate, we're then going to look at the population broken down by age, by place of residence, so comparing Cape Town to Johannesburg to the outlying communities, by different groups of financial well-being, and to Jewish identity strand. So whether people define themselves as Orthodox or Reform or secular. So for each of these subgroup categories, think which group would be the most and the least likely to say that they are going to be considering immigration. Okay, you've got your numbers. Let's see the great reveal. So this is the answer to the first question, the what question. How likely are you to move abroad in the next 5 years? Here's our 1998 survey, where almost a quarter, well, over a quarter of the community said they were likely to immigrate, 27%. In 2005, 7%, a huge reduction for, for over 7 years that immigration sentiment would change is quite striking and needs to be addressed to understand what was going on there. And then, 14 years later in 2019, the most recent survey is that 15% of the community say they are likely to immigrate in the short term. So hands up, who got it close? Who overestimated? Who thought it was much higher? Okay, and who thought it was much less? Yeah? All right. So we're going to take a deep dive into this most recent estimate, this 15% just now, and start understanding who is it made up of. But first, let's try to understand what was going on in these 3 time periods that contributed to the different sentiments on immigration. So in this graph, I've superimposed the GDP growth rate. So it's the best proxy for how the economy is doing. And we see that it's around the 3 to 4% level in the mid-90s. And then it starts to grow, even going above 5% in the mid-2000s. And then you have the global recession of 2008, where South Africa, along with many other countries, most countries, experienced a recession. And then we came out of the recession, but economic growth has since been very sluggish, around 1% mark. And then here we have COVID and post-COVID. So what we see, okay, let me show you the next graph and then we'll interpret. This graph, again, we've got our 3 events of the survey data, but here the light gray line is showing the Rand dollar exchange rate. So in the time when and that's on the right hand side. So when the 1998 survey took place, the Rand to the dollar was 6 Rand to the dollar, to the US dollar. Whereas today, we are around 17 Rand to the US dollar. So for the South Africans in the room, we go up when we see this trend. But these are important economic variables that were taking place when the surveys were being carried out. When the 1998 survey was being carried out, we were in a very, very poor economic circumstances. We were just coming out, or we were actually probably still in the Asian financial crisis, which affected middle income and developing countries severely. and the exchange rate was starting to rise. On the other hand, 2005, when we look back, it was actually a golden period in South Africa. There was political stability and there was an improving economic indicators. GDP growth was rising, and the exchange rate, if we go back a slide, the 2005 survey came at a time when the exchange rate was actually strengthening. So this survey of 2005 took place in a period where things were looking very good. The political and the economic outlook for the country was one of stability and optimism. On the other hand, the 2019 survey took place during a period of political uncertainty. This was just after the period when Jacob Zuma had been president, and there were a whole lot of corruption scandals associated with his presidency. And this was shown in the economic indicators, where the growth rate had been declining steadily for almost 10 years. If we start looking at the subgroups in the population, this graph takes the information that we have from the 2019 survey and then breaks it down by age category. So we had that figure, if we go back a slide. So here we have the 15% of people saying they were likely to immigrate. And we compare this population total to different age cohorts. The brackets on the x-axis show what percentage of the population fall into each category. So about 40% are over 60, close to 40% are between 40 and 59 years, and just less than a quarter are between 18 and 40 years old. And what comes out very clearly is that the youngest cohort, under 40-year-olds, have the highest propensity for immigration. 24% of people in this age group say they are likely to immigrate. Compare that to people who are over 60. In this cohort, only 7% say that they are likely to immigrate. Then we looked at the place of residence. So in South Africa, the main center is Johannesburg. 60% or so live in Johannesburg, a quarter live in Cape Town, and a smaller community, around 7%, are living in Durban. So when we look at this, at the place of residence, there's not much difference. So Cape Townians are the least likely to say that they are going to immigrate. For Cape Town, for residents of Cape Town, 13% say they would immigrate. And the highest group are people who live in other areas besides for Cape Town and Joburg. But there's not a very striking difference in this result, in this subgroup population. Jewish identity strand. So this was a question which was people could self-select which identity they felt that they fitted best into. The majority of South Africans chose traditional. 32% consider themselves to be traditional, which is generally described as the non-observant Orthodox, affiliated to the Orthodox community, but not strict in the observance of Jewish law. The next biggest category is Orthodox, and it overlaps very much with the traditional, followed by people who identify as secular cultural. About 14% fall into this category, 12% identify as progressive or reform, and 8% either as Haredi, Hasidic, or strictly Orthodox. And when we look at which of these groups has the highest likelihood of immigration, it is the Orthodox, the 30% who identify as Orthodox that show the highest propensity towards immigration. This was, I guess, what we would expect. The question asked people's sense of belonging in South Africa. And like I said before, 74% of the population consider their sense of belonging to be strong, while 9% consider their strength of belonging to be weak. And as you would expect, people with a weak sense of belonging have a much higher propensity towards immigration, whereas people who consider their sense of belonging to be in the highest category, the strongest sense of belonging, have a much lower likelihood of immigration compared to the population average. We also looked at financial well-being and likelihood of immigration. This was motivated by the fact that there's a lot of data in the general literature looking at the relationship between financial well-being and immigration. And this, and as you can see, there's not much difference between the different categories, between the wealthy and the reasonably comfortable and those who consider themselves just getting along. And when we ran statistical tests on this data, there was no significant relationship. And that speaks to the fact that South African immigrants are not typical economic migrants. They're not, people who are immigrating are not really doing it because they are looking for an improvement in well-being. Even though we do see that those people who are in the just getting along and the financially poorer category have the highest propensity, it's not significantly different from the other categories. Okay, so that then wraps up the what question, the immigration sentiment, and why, how likely are people to immigrate? Now we move on to the next question, the where. Where are people going? And I asked you to write down where you think people would go. And if you said Israel, you would be correct, because in the most recent survey in 2019, the blue column indicates that 51% of people would choose Israel as their destination country. And if you wrote down Australia, you would also be correct, because and the UK and the United States, because in the 1998 survey and the 2005 survey, those were the main countries that people were looking to move to. So there's a historical trend that immigrants would have gone to Australia and the United States, but what our most recent survey has showed is that that trend has changed significantly. And while people are still going to Australia in the orange and the United States in the red, the majority of people today think that if they immigrate, they will move to Israel. When we broke the destination down by age, we see that Israel dominates across all categories. The younger cohort, while Israel is the main country that they're likely to move to, there's also a significant number of people, close to 20%, who think that they'll move to the UK, and 15% who say they would move to Australia. And compared to the older category, which is much more biased towards Israel. When we look at financial well-being, we see, again, Israel dominates across all wealth bands, but the wealthy, this first column, show more interest in other options compared to the poorer segment of the community. And when we look at age and well-being together, we can start understanding a narrative of why and where people choose to immigrate to. Older and financially less well-off subgroups across the world have less options for immigration. And for these groups, Israel can be seen as a destination of last resort. They haven't got enough, they aren't young enough, and they don't have enough financial assets to be able to meet the point system and be able to get into countries like Canada or Australia or the UK. And therefore, if they want to immigrate, the only option that they have available is Israel. It's very much well, that's the only place I can go to, a destination of last resort. On the other hand, the data tell a different story as well. They also show that a significant share of younger and wealthy people, wealthy subgroups, are choosing to go to Israel. these are groups that have a much easier time getting into other countries, and yet they are choosing that if they had to immigrate, they would want to go to Israel. And so we see, on the one hand, Israel is a destination of last resort, but Israel is also the destination of choice for many people. When we looked at the destination chosen by people, based on where they live, we see again, Israel is dominating across all categories, and Joburgers have the highest propensity to say that they would like, if they immigrate, that they would move towards Israel. I have said it, but I want to reiterate that the stats that we're looking at now when we're comparing age groups come from a survey. So it's not actual movements of people. It's people who are answering a survey question saying, if you were to immigrate, where would you go to? So it captures a sentiment and captures what the general feeling is in a population and then in a subgroup within that population. But how much of this actually materializes into people crossing a border is actually unknown. But it gives an indication of where the community is holding and where people are looking towards. Sorry. So here, this is an interesting graph. So here we're looking at Jewish identity strands, again, from the Haredim on the very left of the graph to the secular. And here, when we ask these people where they want to immigrate to, there's a very clear stepwise relationship with regards to Israel as well as the UK. So 90% of people who identify as Haredim say if they were immigrating, they would be moving to Israel. And you compare that to 19% of people who identify as secular. There's a very strong relationship between Jewish identity and likely destination country. On the other hand, in the purple blocks, we see that the trend goes the other way, where people who identify as secular, 31% of them said that they would likely move to the United Kingdom. And then this declines as one moves, so to speak, up the Jewish identity spectrum, whereas amongst the Orthodox, only 4% say they would move to the UK, and amongst the Haredim, doesn't even show on the graph. And similarly with the other countries, which are not the main destinations, but the secular, progressive members of the community are much more likely to look at other countries that aren't the main destination countries for South African Jews. So why would people consider leaving South Africa? So this table shows the question as it was presented in the survey, and people were given up to 18 different options, and they could choose their first reason, second main reason, and third main reason of why they would be motivated to leave South Africa. So in this graph, we show the results of that, comparing it over time. So 1998, 2005, and most recently 2019. In 1998, and I'm sure if you had to guess what the main reason was, you would probably have guessed this: crime. The dark gray, oh, where's my marker gone? This dark gray brownie color block was the most significant reason for people saying they would leave South Africa. 45% of people who said they were planning to immigrate, that was their primary motivating factor. And if you compare the different graphs, this has declined over time. So in 1998, it was 45%, but in 2005, it's about half the size, and it has continued to decline. So while crime was the most significant reason in 1998, it has declined over time, but still remains a significant component of people's decisions to immigrate, even in 2019. In 2005, this middle line here, we see a completely different picture compared to 1998, which again speaks to the fact that 7 years late between these surveys, South Africa was in a different stage. The political and socio-economic outlook was different, and this is reflected in the motivations that people are giving for immigrating. In this period, people are choosing pull reasons, as opposed to push reasons like crime, which were the remotivating factors in 1998. In 2005, the majority of people, 35%, said they would immigrate in order to be with family. And the other major category, which changed compared to 1998, is this purple block, which is they would move because there was a career or study opportunity that they wanted to take up. 2005 was a very different South Africa to 1998. How about 2019? Interestingly, even though economically the political and economic outlook is very similar to 98, the reasons given are different. In 2019, it is not crime that dominates the motivations, but it is the concern about the future of South Africa. People are not as worried about security, but they are worried about what the future is going to bring. The other interesting thing when comparing the motivations for immigrating over time is the changing role of Israel. One of the options that people had was a desire to live in Israel. And in 1998 and 2005, this was pretty much the same. Approximately 3 to 4% of the population were motivated to immigrate from South Africa because they were Zionistic. They believed in the state of Israel and wanted to make Aliyah. And one can expect that there would always be some proportion of the community that would fit into that category, and that this percentage would be pretty constant over time. But what we see is that in 2019, this number increased threefold, almost fourfold, from 4% to 15%. 15% of people are saying that if they were immigrating, the main reason why they would do so is from a desire to live in interesting. That is a big change. That is a big change that we need to speak to in terms of what has changed in South Africa and the world. When we look at age and the motivation for immigration, as you probably would expect, people who are under 40 have a very different set of motivations to people who are over 60. In the under 40 category, the main reasons are concern about the future, as well as personal safety concerns. Whereas when one looks in the over 60-year group, so older than 60-year group, here the main reason is to be with family, as well as a desire to live in Israel. Those come out as being the most important. And the middle group, 40 to 60-year-olds, really have a combination of both of these features. By place of residence, here we see that people living in Johannesburg are the most concerned about the future of South Africa, followed by personal safety concerns. In Cape Town, these components are reduced, but not significantly. But people living outside of the main center, so this is Durban, Pretoria, as well as the outlying areas. In this category, we see the desire to live in Israel being the most prominent, as well as a desire to join family living abroad. Again, I show the financial well-being, but there's really no strong differences between the different financial well-being groups. Wealthy people are more concerned about personal safety than other groups, but it's really, there's not a very strong trend to be spoken about. And again, like I've said, South Africans are not typical economic migrants, so this fits into that understanding. When it comes to Jewish identity and the motivation for immigrating, again, we see this very, very prominent stepwise difference between Jewish identity groups. Consider amongst Haredim, and well, not just Haredim, but Haredim and the strictly Orthodox segment of the population, where 40% say that they desire to immigrate is because they want to live in Israel. That decreases by half in the Orthodox group, and again by half, even more than half in the traditional group, and again by half when looking at the secular group. It's a very clear difference between the Jewish identity strands. What about progressive? Well, progressive kind of fit in between the different groups. They don't really fit on the scale between Haredim, Orthodox, traditional, and secular, and they have aspects of both Orthodox as well as aspects of secular South Africans. And the opposite relationship we find when it comes to concern about future. The group that is most concerned would be the secular as well as the traditional, and that declines amongst the Haredim and strictly Orthodox group. Our survey asked people for they had the option to give their first reason, their most important reason, as well as a second and third reason for wanting to immigrate. And while the overall picture is much the same, so this is what we've been looking at so far, the first reasons, and then this is the second reason, third reasons, and then if we combine all the reasons that people give, we see that these smaller factors start becoming more prominent. Things like, in the yellow, education of children; in the pink, a better lifestyle, for example, cultural or outdoor life. And in a small amount, but it features, are concerns around affirmative action, as well as poor municipal services and infrastructure in South Africa. And these smaller reasons, even though they're not the dominant reason, they paint a picture, because most people who immigrate almost always have multiple reasons. They might be the leading reason, but there usually are multiple factors that play a part. And with this analysis, we're able to see what those other factors are. So as I start to conclude the talk, I want to bring it all together and try leave you with what the take-home messages are. So first of all, one has to appreciate that when one looks at community survey data, one's trying to understand population level trends, as opposed to uniquely individual trends. For any one individual or family or household that is making the decision about immigrating, there will be uniquely personal factors that go into that decision. And often one can identify the point in time to be related to a change in personal situation. Perhaps a person has just gotten married, or they've matriculated or graduated, or they've sold their business, or they've lost a job, or they've entered retirement. These are changes in life stage or economic shocks that bring about decision-making, and where people are more likely to consider making major moves. The second point that we have to appreciate in discussing South African Jewish immigration is that it's not a uniquely Jewish trend. There is a major trend and an understanding that there is skilled labor, especially, is immigrating from South Africa, and Jewish migration fits into that context. When we ask the question about what are the immigration drivers, what are the factors that are motivating people, we've seen a change over time. In the 1990s, crime was the main reason that was making people look to further to looking to moving abroad. But in 2019, it is less a concern about the current state of affairs, but it's more a concern about what the future will bring. And this falls into what I've been pointing out across the talk, is that South African Jewish immigrants are not typical economic migrants. The people are not motivated to move because of better jobs and an improvement in economic or material well-being. Rather, prospective immigrants typically anticipate that they will experience a drop in their standard of living upon immigration. And this speaks to a trade-off that immigrants face, that when they immigrate, there is often an understanding that they are trading off a relatively high standard of living in South Africa for a more stable and predictable economic and political future in the Western countries typically chosen historically. We've shown that the macroeconomic environment plays a big impact on the immigration sentiment. And this was shown most clearly when we looked at the 2005 results compared to 1998 and 2019. When the economy is doing well and the political economic outlook for South Africa is strong, immigration sentiment is lowest. And if there's any line of optimism from this report for South African Jewry, this finding suggests an alternative path for South African Jewry should more favorable economic conditions come into existence. We also saw in the data the strong influence of having family abroad, that was one of the main reasons why people would look to immigrate. And this speaks to the strength and the importance played by social networks. Having family and friends in the country one is moving to lowers the barriers to immigrating, while at the same time, it weakens the ties that bind individuals to South Africa. So because of this factor, we can say that even if all of South Africa's social problems were resolved in an instant, we could still expect to see immigration trends persist because of the fact that 3 out of 5 South Africans have close family living abroad. We also saw, and this was one of the key findings of this paper, is the rise of Israel as the preferred destination. That 51% of people in the most recent survey think that if they had to move, they would move to Israel, compared to a much lower amount in previous surveys. And this speaks to quite a few different trends that are going on simultaneously. Firstly, when one compares, let's say, Israel in 2019 compared to 2005, the Israeli economy has improved significantly over that time on multiple factors in terms of inflation, in terms of GDP per capita. There's been a big improvement, and the economy has also diversified a lot. Secondly, there are major changes in the Israeli security situation comparing 2005, where Israel was just coming out of the Second Intifada, to 2019, which was a relatively peaceful time in Israel. We also have other data that show that attachment to Israel amongst South African Jewish population, which has always been strong, has also improved over this time period. However, while these factors all play a role, the most important of them is most likely to be one of pragmatism. In a global context where there are more and more restrictive immigration policies, it is more difficult to get into Australia, the United Kingdom, and America than it was in the past. Furthermore, the exchange rate that has affected the South African rand mean that affordability is a real concern, that it is much less affordable for South Africans to take their savings and be able to afford to live in countries with strong exchange rates. And finally, or on the other side, Israel's law of return means that Jews, no matter their age and no matter their economic, financial well-being, are accepted into Israel, and moreover, are offered certain benefits, certain financial benefits, to ease the immigration process. So for both practical, well, not both, but for practical reasons, Israel has become more viable and accessible than other countries in the last 15 years. And finally, when we looked at the subgroups, we saw that Israel was prominent over all subgroups except for the secular. But the subgroup that is most likely to immigrate, and this is not a surprise, is those people who are under 40, the younger age cohort in the community. And then I'm interested to open this up to what people think But what does this mean now? What happened since 2019? The last 5 years, a lot has changed. We've seen the world become even more restrictive towards migration. For example, Britain, UK separating from Europe has meant that has been another country that's changed immigration laws. So it is more difficult to immigrate. In South Africa, on the one hand, we had the worst riots in 2021, which really shook people and made people very concerned. On the other hand, this year we've had a very successful election amidst quite tense circumstances, and now have a government of national unity, which presents a very different political outlook for the future of the country. And finally, Israel is at war. Israel is not the country of 2019 today. And how that will affect people's immigration decisions is surely to be a factor in understanding what will happen to the South African Jewish community going forward. Thank you very much. That brings my presentation to an end, and I look forward to engaging with you.
Thank you so much, Reviva, for a really fascinating talk and lots of super interesting number crunching. And we have now lots of time for questions and comments. There is one question in the chat, but as Geraldine said in the outset, we're really encouraging people to put up their hands rather than just conveying questions in the chat. Please convey them personally. I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask the first question myself, and then I see Leon already has his hand up to ask a question. But Reviva, I was thinking, you know, our ability to crunch these numbers and to extract information from them and to understand the issues really depends on the conceptualization of the original studies and the questions that they decided to ask, because that's the data that was gathered. So I was curious to know from you, as someone who researches these subjects, if there are questions that you wish had been asked, if there's information that you would want to know about the community that you think we know less about or would want to know more about in order to understand these issues more deeply.
So good question. So creating a survey is to do a good survey, to run a good survey, it takes so much time. I help people out with this a lot in my work, and people are always surprised with how much time goes into developing questions, because you want to try as much as possible be consistent with surveys that have been in the past, so that you can do these time analyses and to be able to compare them across time. So you want to keep the wording as similar as possible, but you also want to bring in factors that have perhaps changed that might not have been relevant in a survey of 20 years ago. So your question is very much on point. What probably would have been interesting to have asked is more questions about migration within South Africa. That's something that we have some idea that it's taking place, but it's very anecdotal at this point. We have a sense the main trends within South Africa seem to be a movement of people from the Gauteng region to the Cape region. The Western Cape has a different government, it has a different lifestyle, and perhaps because of work becoming a lot more flexible, that people can either work from home or they can migrate. We're definitely seeing anecdotally that people are making that move, but it would have been interesting to have tried to understand that if we had to do the survey again today.
Thank you. Leon, go ahead.
Thank you. Kavod, an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Your work is very similar to the work that I did for the Kimberley community.
Oh, really?
I don't know if you've seen my paper. I actually gave it to the University of Cape Town. And you can also find it. It was published on Kahila Links, the Kimberley community on Kahila Links. You can find it there.
Thank you. I will
My
look that up.
questions, yeah, it were very similar. I was trying to find out where all the Kimberley Jews had gone to, both internally in South Africa, because the youth moved out of Kimberley to go to university, and they moved to Johannesburg and Cape Town. So the survey tried to map that, and also it tried to map where the Kimberley community had immigrated to, and your results just duplicate what I did. The results show that the Kimberley Jews actually, the majority of them went to Australia, the UK, the United States and Canada, exactly the same as your survey proved. Yeah. So it would be interesting for you to read the paper and, maybe use some information that you if you, extend your research further, you might want to use some of that information.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. Making a note. Kahila Links.
Yeah, and in fact, my paper, I identified the people by name, because what I found is that I'd lost contact with all my friends that I'd grown up with in Kimberley, and I wanted to know where the heck they were. So that was another motivating factor, that I tried to find exactly the country, the city where they were. It wasn't an easy survey because nobody actually wanted to help me. And fortunately, you'll see a list of people in Kimberley who did try and help me. I found a few people in Australia. I found some people in the US, and they try to, help me find all these people. So I think I got almost 95% of the people, at least, of the Kimberley community. Yeah, so it proved your results, and I'm actually quite happy, that at least my paper, has got some validity to it. I was really worried that my results were, not really valid, but it seems, to replicate what you had done. And a question I have is, a lot of the Jews actually now are going to Israel because there are no other options. It's very expensive when you have to move from South Africa to like Canada, where I am. The rand being so weak, if you were to bring your pension across, I don't think you'd be able to pay for coffee here for 1 month. So that is a real issue. It's one I think you mentioned that, is that the affordability of converting the rand to the Canadian dollar, you just couldn't live on it. So it means that the older you get, the harder it is also to find a job. When I emigrated, I was 57. It took me probably over a year to find a job. I found temporary work, but I never found a permanent position. So it was very difficult. They don't recognize South African qualifications anymore, especially those who have graduated after like 2000, when they said the standards of South African education had declined. So to get a job here now, it would be very difficult. The majority of businesses would not recognize South African qualification. So there's a lot of, going to Israel is probably one's only choice that you really have now, because of the difficulties here in Canada, and I've got family in America, and it's exactly the same thing. I recall going back, I don't know, about 40 years ago, when I tried to emigrate when I was a lot younger. And I went to Cleveland, Ohio, where I had family, and I tried to find a job there. And they told me, what does a person who lives in the jungle know about the United States accounting practice? So that's their attitude. Why must I bring in a South African who I've got to teach when I've got a whole lot of guys knocking on my door here who are born and educated here in America? So it's going to be very, very difficult for South Africans to immigrate.
I feel
You
like
know,
that would be a
much harder and harder. So I think Israel is the only choice. You know, you've got the law of the return. They have to take you, and they've got some great incentives. You don't have to pay tax. You get, I don't know, all sorts of your appliances and all that sort of thing. So I think that's the only choice for the South Africans.
And we see that already in the data. You see that with the number of people who are choosing Israel over other countries. But I think you speak to a very important truth that perhaps needs to be more widely known, that while Israel is a viable country, it's also expensive.
Thank you, Leon and Reviva. Leslie has a up, and then I'm going to convey some questions from the chat. Go ahead, Leslie. Yep, please go ahead and unmute yourself. The lady who's holding up her hand, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. No, you'll need to unmute yourself. It may be that whoever's host can maybe ask to unmute. I'm not host, so I can't do it. There we go.
Hold on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Go ahead.
I want to congratulate you on a lovely presentation, a very good presentation. My name is Jean Dubovitz, and I'm originally from Cape Town, South Africa.
I
immigrated in 1977 to United States of America. And one of the comments I'd like to say, which I think is quite important when one is emigrating, is where you're going to get into, what country you're going to get into. It's becoming much, much more difficult for people to, for instance, get into the United States. I now live in Washington, D.C., and I'm very familiar with things in the United States. As we all know, we've just come out of an election. And so I think that's a big factor when emigrating, is where you're going to be able to, which country, and all the red tape and the visas and everything. And I want to comment, when I left in 1977, which was a good many years ago, one of the factors that was in our favor, my husband is a professional person, I'm professional, and was that the rand was actually worth more than the United States dollar. So I think that was a tremendous asset for us. I think another thing that is very important, if you have a degree, and I think that certainly does help in getting a job, wherever you land up. Being a professional person has a great advantage. But I also think going at a younger age, I was 30 years old when I left, and I had one child, and I think it's much, much easier. If I think of emigrating now, so many years later, it would be very hard. So I do say, for anybody who's considering emigrating, I think the younger you are, I think the easier it is in many ways, certainly to fit in. You meet people through your children, through your synagogue, etc. So I just wanted to say it was a very interesting presentation, and I wish you luck in future presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. So I'm going to convey a few questions from the chat, Reviva, and a few of them are really just clarifying aspects of the surveys. One question was how many survey respondents made up the data results. I know you put that on a slide, but perhaps to just recapitulate those. How were the survey recipients selected? And someone asking for a clarification of the difference between traditional and orthodox.
Sure. So in the 1998 and the 2005 survey, so those were done face-to-face interviews, and there were 1,000 participants across South Africa. The 2019, the most recent survey, we changed the method and we ran it as an online survey. And we actually ran this in a few stages, because one of the biggest concerns when running a survey is to make sure that you have the right population group that are answering the survey, that you don't just put it on Facebook and anybody comes and answers it, but they're actually not within the Jewish community. So the first stage that we ran the survey, we actually used known lists of people. So we had the Cape Town Jewish community is very organized. They have a list of about 12 to 14,000 people, of people who have either, they just collect names of people who are in the community. So we were able to send the survey out to people who we knew were for sure in the community in Cape Town. Similarly, in Durban, they also have very good community records. And in Johannesburg, which is a much bigger community, but it doesn't have as much cohesion in terms of organization, we looked at a few different options of people who held lists of community members, and we worked with the Chevra Kadisha, which is the social welfare organization for the Johannesburg Jewish community. And it has the most extensive list. And our biggest concern actually with the Joburg community was that we might miss out on the middle, because the Chevra Kadisha would have good information on donors and they would have good information on recipients. But we might miss out on the middle band, who are neither donors or recipients. But once we got the results of our survey and we started doing tests across income bands and across questions on, do people make donations in the community, and the Johannesburg Jewish community has a high what would I put this as? They're very much connected to the Chevra Kadisha. They feel a lot of pride in their community organizations, and almost everyone in the community supports the Chevra Kadisha at some point and over time. So that was our first stage, was using lists in the community. Then the second stage is we opened it up, and anybody who wanted to, we advertised our survey through mailing lists and through Facebook sites and pamphlets, and anybody could sign up to complete the survey. And so there was more risk involved in that level, in that stage, but it also allowed us to reach a wider community, not the core community who were connected. And then our third stage was a rolling invitation, where people could send, if they'd filled out the survey, they could send it out to other people in their own network who might not have heard about the survey. And again, we were able to check the results of the survey, that there was no major corruption or sabotage of the data. So that's how we ran the survey and made sure that it was valid. And the criteria for people to answer the survey was that they had to be living in South Africa, an adult over the age of 18, and had to identify as Jewish in any manner or form. Later on in the survey, we started asking questions of whether you were Jewish by birth or by conversion, and what it meant to you to be Jewish. But to be able to get into the survey, if you identified as Jewish, you didn't need to provide a ketubah or a Brit Milah certificate. And we had over 4,000 respondents, which was just astounding. I mean, I wish I could remember the numbers offhand, but it's like, it's a higher turnout rate, a higher response rate than America had with the Pew study. So it was a very, very successful survey on that account. And then your final question was the difference between traditional and Orthodox. So if you'll allow me, Shirley, like if I could have gone back and ran the survey, I would have actually had more categories of questions when people could self-identify as Jewish, the Jewish strand. And this really was a compromise between what the questions were that were asked in previous years, as well as questions that are asked in Jewish community surveys across the world, and trying to create a good compromise to be able to be comparable. But of course, meanings are locally relevant, and certain terms have meaning in one context that have a different meaning in another context. And in South Africa, the term traditional is quite unique. It pertains to people who are affiliated to Orthodox institutions. So people who, if they are getting married or having a baby or want to put a mezuzah up on their door, they are going to contact, or God forbid, if there's a bereavement, they are going to contact their Orthodox community rabbi to be involved in those life stage events. But in terms of practice, there's a whole range of options, from keeping kosher when it comes to meat, to keeping well, not fully kosher, but keeping kosher at home, but eating non-kosher out, to not keeping kosher at all, and any number of variations amongst that. Orthodox, on the other hand, overlaps a lot with traditional and is an indicator of community affiliation. So someone would select Orthodox as opposed to progressive. And certainly there will be people who have selected Orthodox who are Shomer Shabbat, and you will also have people who have selected Orthodox who are completely non-observant. And so those two categories do overlap significantly, but at the same time, there is a difference. And we see that in the people who are answering it. So for example, when we had the results on people where they would choose to go to, people who choose who identify as Orthodox are more likely to choose Israel than people who are traditional. So you see the differences coming out in the how people have answered the survey questions. Certainly a study to be conducted, so watch this space.
Thank you. Right, Gail.
Hi, thanks so much, Reviva, for a lovely talk. I really enjoyed it, and I found your variables that you chose, to examine and check, and very, very interesting. There were just, one or two questions that I sort of felt as I was listening to you. Number one is the place of anti-Semitism. How much of a role did that play in people, in Jews leaving South Africa? It wasn't mentioned, actually, not even once. And I remember it as certainly being a factor or something. And when I read about South Africa today, I do notice that coming up a lot. I left in 1976 and landed up in Israel. And the second thing is that, there aren't very many ideological sort of terms that you use or that you checked. Real ideology. I'm not talking about feeling Jewish or being observant, but like Zionistic or, these just words and sort of ideas that have gone, right? So that was another thing that struck me. And then, of course, the last question, which makes me feel that you really do need to do another study, is that what happened now? If we're talking 2024 and we're looking at Israel, I find it very hard to imagine that South African Jews would want to come here, because we are living through a nightmare, and there's certainly, not really at this point, shall we say, a real positive pull to people to come and live here. So that's another thing that, struck me as I was listening. And each time you did survey, it was a matter of 4 or 5 years, and now 2019 to 24, we've got 5 years. And I should suspect that there'll be very different surveys. Thank you.
Thanks for those points, Gail. Let me speak to anti-Semitism. So the expert on anti-Semitism in South Africa is Milton Shane, who was the previous director of the Kaplan Center. And I don't know if he's ever spoken on this forum, but Shirley and Geraldine, I would definitely recommend that he be invited to talk about how anti-Semitism has looked in South Africa and has changed over the years. The way we addressed anti-Semitism was really to try and compare South Africa to other countries. And when we asked people in the survey, and this is in 2019, 9% of people said that they had been exposed to anti-Semitism. Either, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was like verbal or personal harassment. And I mean, that's not nothing, but compared to other countries, I think Australia, it was around 10% of people in this Australian Jewish community who had that level of experience with anti-Semitism, and it was much higher, closer to 24% in Europe and 60% amongst Americans. So while anti-Semitism is not, it certainly does exist in South Africa, the levels are much lower than compared to other countries, and certainly in the other countries that Jews are moving to. Having said that, though, like you point out, and this actually speaks to both of your points, is like what's happened in the last 5 years. In October 7th has opened up new insights into underlying anti-Semitism that we thought was like dormant volcanoes that have suddenly erupted, that we thought were long since gone. And that certainly has happened in South Africa, especially in the few months post October 7th. However, in recent months, oh gosh, this is a big topic. It depends where you are. Universities, things are really, there's a lot of tension. But at the same time, we had a sukkah up at the Kaplan Center, completely open to the university. It wasn't entrance, access controlled. And there was no concern with Jewish students coming to sit in the sukkah. No concern at all. And there was no question it was going to be put up. No one ever questioned, like, maybe this year we shouldn't. So there's a lot to be figured out and trying to understand what anti-Semitism looks like. And while there's a lot of tension, thank God it hasn't manifested in physical harassment. And then to speak to your point about what has happened, what happens now, I agree with you. I think immigration trends will change. I think Leon also spoke to the point about, the changing circumstances of the world becoming more restrictive in terms of their immigration policies. Israel is not the country it was in 2019. But if people want to immigrate, there are not many options. And Israel is still an option that has its doors open. So yes, it will be interesting to see what the next survey shows.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before I call on Hazel, who's patiently been waiting, I'm just going to convey one more question from the chat, which asks about the 2021-22 wave of immigration to Israel.
So
how we
this is
understand
COVID.
that.
Yeah. So this we don't have data on from the national surveys, but I've been trying to keep track of just community stats that we have, from different organizations in the community, and what 2021 I think had the highest levels. I don't have the data at my fingertips, but had the highest number of olim, highest number of immigrants going to Israel, I think in I don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years. But when one looks at that over time, it actually, 2021 was really high. 2020 was really low because, there was COVID and lockdown and there weren't flights taking place. So what seems to have happened is that 2020 was a really low year for immigration, for Aliyah, but that those people just got buffered up and went in 2021. So 2021, you had normal levels of Aliyah, plus the 2020 people who had to delay their Aliyah. That's what it seems. And looking at the Aliyah rates since then, I don't have post October 7th, but for 2023 and 2024, it seems like it's coming down. It's still there, but it seems like it's declining.
Interesting. Thank you. Hazel, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for your presentation, Reviva. Very interesting. I actually was taken as a child. I was 14. My parents moved to London and it was very, very difficult. It was, I faced a lot of, not anti-Semitism, but bullying at school, hence my accent. I don't have your lovely South African accents anymore. And I really miss South Africa. We do go back quite often, but now sadly a lot of people have either died or left, so it's quite different. But I miss the weather, like you say. And my dad, he made the decision, like you said, really for education, for the family, for safety. And it was the early 70s, so it was we were one of the first families to move quite early, 72. And yeah, it's been tough in London, very tough. I find British people, I don't know if any of you guys live in London or UK, it's very, very different. And you know, not as sort of friendly and easy in this country. But I'm really interested in finding out more about my family history, because I had grandparents from Latvia and Lithuania, and they moved to Cape Town. My parents were born in Cape Town, and my late sister was born in Cape Town, and I was in Johannesburg. So I really want to find out more, and thank you very much for this interesting information. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that feedback.
Thank you, Hazel. Veronica, go ahead. Nice to see you. Veronica, you'll need to unmute. There you go.
Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Veronica.
Yes. Hi. I've just got not a question but a comment, because recently I had to go to Johannesburg to do research at the Board of Deputies, and I was quite surprised by Johannesburg. Maybe it was simply because I hadn't been there for a long time, but about the sort of advanced planning for the community in Johannesburg. I, for instance, stayed at a place, I don't know if you know of it, it's called Genesis Suites.
Mm-hmm.
It's specific that was built, it's got units specifically built for Jews. It's kosher, 2 kosher restaurants. There's obviously there's a Pick and Pay there, Woolworths, Clicks. Underneath you, you see kippot and shatels everywhere, and it's adjacent to Glen Hazel. And the board is very near. And I think I also saw when I was taken there, on the way I saw the Torah Academy and etc. And the person who was driving me explained that Johannesburg had been planned like that. And somebody else who visited me said to me that he and his wife had been living in Emigration, and eventually they would definitely have to move from Emigration, which simply wasn't as Jewish as it was once upon a time, and into this Glen Hazel area. And I just found it very, very interesting that there had been advanced planning in this way. And I found it extremely, what's the word? Well, basically very comfortable being there. And I never knew anything about this.
Joburg is a wonderful community. Joburg is really, I mean, I live in Cape Town, and we used to have family in Johannesburg, and really, Joburg isn't known for its beauty, but there are trees all over the place, and the community is very warm and strong. The planning that you speak to, I know is taking place in Cape Town. I haven't worked so much with the Johannesburg board recently, but certainly in Cape Town, people are trying to get an understanding about what the community is going to look like in the years ahead, and trying to identify where funding should flow to. I mean, in one of the decisions that was taken recently was, it was during COVID, it was 2020 or 2021, whereas one of the primary schools of Herzliya is the main Jewish day school in Cape Town. There are a couple of other more Torah-orientated schools, but Cape Town, Herzliya is definitely the main one. And there used to be 3 primary school campuses, and the decision was taken that there were not enough students living in the southern suburbs anymore to warrant the costs involved in the upkeep and maintenance and operational aspects of the school, and the decision was taken on a community level, or at least by the board of Herzliya, to close the Constantia campus of Herzliya. So there speaking to your point, there definitely are people who are planning, and these are difficult decisions. I don't envy the people who are making the decisions about how to just choose which institutions to keep and invest in, and which to close. That must be very, very difficult decisions.
Thank you, Reviva. Well, if there are no more questions, then I think I would just thank you so much again for a really fascinating, insightful talk, and for bringing your expertise and helping us slice through all of this data and understand so many of these different trends. So on behalf of everybody, thank you so much again.
Such a pleasure.
I will hand us back over to Geraldine to close the meeting.
Well, thank you all so much, and thank you, Shirley, for suggesting this series and for offering the talks, which, you know, really get to the tachlis of things. And so we're really happy to have this series. The next one will be on the 27th of November, when Gavin Baynott-Smolin is going to talk to us about how people found relatives after the war, during or after the Second World War. It's research that he's been doing. And then on the 6th or whatever it is, the first Wednesday in December, Shirley herself will be filling in all the bits and pieces of what research is happening where. So this is really good. I'd also like to mention, if I may, that Gail is running maybe you can talk yourself, Gail, about that. I'll just mention that I said to people on email that Dave Bloom is talking about Zimbabwe and Zambian Jewish communities to a group called Kesha, who seem to be looking at Jewish communities all over the world. So if you want to know more about that, you know, write to us at info@hol.website, and please look at the website. You know, the Kimberley Kahila links is easily findable from the communities page of the whole website, and it's easy peasy. It's www.chol.website. So, you know, you don't even need a pencil and paper for that. So thank you again, Shirley. Thank you to Reviva. Thank you to Adam. And now, Gail, would you just like to tell us about your stories session that you've snuck in?
Okay, it's just that I won't be able to right now because there's somebody stuck in the lift again, and it's my duty to help them, and I need to go. I'm so sorry, but I'll send. It's just this coming, no, on the 20th, we have two South Africans who are living outside of South Africa, who are going to talk about the books that they've written. So it'll be lovely seeing you there, and I'm sorry I have to go. Bye-bye.
Stories.
Thank you,
Gail. Thank you, everyone. If you want to have our latest information, please, sorry, that's my phone ringing, write to info@hol.website, and we'll keep you posted of what's going on. Okay, so thank you to everybody, and see you next time. Look forward to that. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.